The Nervous System by Nadine, Angelique, and Gabi.
The basic structural unit of the nervous system is a nerve cell, or neuron. It consists of the following parts. The cell body contains the nucleus and other cellular organelles. The dendrite is typically a short, abundantly branched, slender extension of the cell body that receives stimuli. The axon is typically a long, slender extension of the cell body that sends nerve impulses. A nerve impulse begins at the tips of the dendrite branches, passes through the dendrites to the cell body, then through the axon, and finally terminates at branches of the axon.
Are you guys paying attention?
Only barely.
Neurons can be classified into three general groups by their functions. Sensory neurons receive the initial stimulus. For example, sensory neurons embedded in the retina of the eye are stimulated by light, while certain sensory neurons in the hand are stimulated by touch. Motor neurons stimulate effectors, target cells that produce some kind of response. For example, motor neurons may stimulate muscles, sweat glands, or cells in the stomach. Interneurons are located in the spinal cord or brain and receive impulses from sensory neurons or send impulses to motor neurons. Interneurons are integrators, evaluating impulses for appropriate responses. The transmission of nerve impulse along a neuron from one end to the other occurs as a result of chemical changes across the membrane of the neuron. The membrane of an unstimulated neuron is polarized, that is, there is a difference in electrical charge between the outside and inside of the membrane. In particular, the inside is negative with respect to the outside. Polarization is established by maintaining an excess of sodium ions on the outside and an excess of potassium ions on the inside. A certain amount of sodium and potassium is always leaking across the membrane, but sodium and potassium active transport pumps in the membrane actively restore the ions to the appropriate side. Other ions, such as large negatively charged proteins and nucleic acids, reside inside the cell. It is these large negatively charged ions that contribute to the overall negative charge on the inside of the cell membrane compared to the outside.
The following events characterize the transmission of a nerve impulse. Resting potential and graded potentials. The resting potential describes the unstimulated, polarized state of a neuron. A stimulus arriving at the plasma membrane of a neuron can open or close a gated ion channel. Depending upon the kind of ion channel activated, the membrane potential can become depolarized, or more positive on the inside, or hyperpolarized, or more negative on the inside. Weak stimuli that cause small variations in the membrane potential are called graded potentials. Because ion leakage across the membrane reestablishes the resting potential, a graded potential is a local event, with the magnitude of the stimulus decaying as the stimulus flows along the neuron. Depolarization and action potentials. In response to a stimulus, voltage-gated ion channels in the membrane suddenly open and permit the sodium on the outside to rush into the cell. As the positively charged sodium rush in, the charge on the cell membrane becomes depolarized. If the stimulus is strong enough, that is, if it is above a certain threshold, more sodium gates open, increasing the inflow of sodium even more, causing an action potential or complete depolarization. Once this action potential is attained, the sodium channels become inactivated, but neighboring sodium channels are activated. In a positive feedback fashion, the action potential travels down the length of the neuron as open sodium gates stimulate neighboring sodium gates to open. Note that because sodium channels become inactivated with the passing of the action potential, the nerve impulse can travel only in the forward direction. The action potential is an all or nothing event. When the stimulus fails to produce a depolarization that exceeds the threshold value, no action potential results. But when the threshold potential is exceeded, complete depolarization occurs. Repolarization. In response to the inflow of sodium, another kind of voltage-gated ion channel opens. this time allowing the potassium on the inside to exit the cell. The movement of potassium out of the cell causes repolarization by restoring the original membrane polarization. Unlike the resting potential, however, the potassium ions are on the outside and the sodium ions are in the inside. Hyperpolarization. By the time the potassium voltage-gated ions close, more potassium ions have moved out of the cell than are actually necessary to establish the original polarized potential. Thus, the membrane becomes hyperpolarized. Refractory period. With the passage of the action potential, the sodium voltage-gated ion channels remain inactivated, and the neuron persists in a refractory state in which it cannot respond to new stimuli. Also, the cell membrane is polarized, but some of the sodium and potassium ions are the wrong sides of the membrane. To reestablish the original distribution of these ions, the sodium and potassium are returned to their resting potential location by sodium/potassium active transport pumps in the cell membrane. Not until after the resting potential is reestablished do the sodium voltage gate ion channels become responsive to a stimulus once again. Some neurons possess a myelin sheath, which consists of a series of Schwann cells that encircle the axon. The Schwann cells act as insulators and are separated by gaps of unsheathed axon called nodes of Ranvier. Instead of traveling continuously down the axon, the action potential jumps from node to node, thereby speeding up propagation of the impulse.
A synapse, or synaptic cleft, is the gap that separates adjacent neurons. Transmission of an impulse across a synapse from presynaptic cell to postsynaptic cell may be electrical or chemical. In electrical synapses, the action potential travels through gap junctions, small tubes of the cytoplasm that connect adjacent cells. In most animals, however, the synaptic clefts are traversed by chemicals. Calcium gates open when action potential reaches the end of an axon. The depolarization of a membrane causes voltage-gated channels to open and allow calcium to enter the cell. Synaptic vesicles release neurotransmitter. The influx of calcium into the terminal end of an axon causes synaptic vesicles to merge with the presynaptic membrane, releasing molecules of a chemical called a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitter binds with postsynaptic receptors. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds with the receptor proteins on the postsynaptic membrane. Different proteins are receptors for different neurotransmitters. The postsynaptic membrane is excited or inhibited. Depending upon the kind of neurotransmitter and the kind of membrane receptor, there are two possible outcomes for the postsynaptic membrane. The first is, if sodium gates open, the membrane becomes depolarized and results in an excitatory postsynaptic potential, called EPSP. If the threshold potential is exceeded, an action potential is generated. Or, potassium gates open, the membrane becomes more polarized and results in inhibitory postsynaptic potential, or IPSP. As a result, it becomes more difficult to generate an action potential on this membrane. The neurotransmitter is degraded and recycled. After the neurotransmitter binds to the postsynaptic membrane receptors, it is broken down by enzymes in the synaptic cleft. For example, a common neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, is broken down by cholinesterase. Degraded neurotransmitters are recycled by the presynaptic cell. Common neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is commonly secreted at neurotransmitter junctions, the gaps between motor neurons and muscle cells, where it stimulates muscles to contract. At other kinds of junctions, it may produce an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin are derived from amino acids and are mostly secreted between neurons of the central nervous system. GABA is usually an inhibitory neurotransmitter among the neurons in the brain. A reflex arc is a rapid, involuntary response to a stimulus. It consists of 2 or 3 neurons, a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and in some reflex arcs, an interneuron. Although neurons may transmit information about the reflex response to the brain does not actually integrate the sensory and motor activity.
The brain!
The brain.
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 The brain is the master processor and integrator of the nervous system. The vertebrate brain appears early in embryonic development as 3 bulges. Subsequent development leads to the various parts of the adult brain. Hypothalamus and pituitary gland, sources of regulatory hormones, develop from the forebrain.
This is a nervous system. It is a network of many nerve cells that together work. They carry messages fast as lightning through your whole body. Don't even feel a thing. Every single thought and every action, every reflex and reaction is caused by interaction that results from the nervous system. Oh, yeah. It's the nerve. It's the nerve. The nervous system. The nervous system. The nervous system. The nervous system. Your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves are connected together, and together they work. It's very complex. More than any object, a stimulus is when you feel something hot. The sensory receptors in your hands feel it a lot. The signal goes through the sensory neurons now toward the spinal cord with a sound. The signal is in the spinal cord. The motor neuron to the muscle, it travels toward. Now you pull back. You pull back real fast. Ooh, because you didn't expect. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a reflex. Ooh, yeah. Many nerve cells that together work. They carry messages fast as lightning through your whole body. Don't even feel a thing. Every single thought and every action, every reflex and reaction is caused by interaction that results from the nervous system. It's the nerve. It's the nerve. The nervous system. The nervous system. Oh.